Chapter 12 of Nightmare Abbey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain and is read by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Nightmare Abbey by Thomas Love Peacock. Chapter 12. It was the custom of the Honourable Mr. Listless, on adjourning from the bottle to the ladies, to retire for a few moments to make a second toilette, that he might present himself in becoming taste. Fatout, attending as usual, appeared with a countenance of great dismay, and informed his master that he had just ascertained that the abbey was haunted. Mrs. Hilary's gentlewoman, for whom Fatout had lately conceived a tendresse, had been, as she expressed it, fritted out of her 17 senses the preceding night, as she was retiring to her bedchamber, by a ghastly figure which she had met stalking along one of the galleries, wrapped in a white shroud, with a bloody turban on its head. She had fainted away with fear, and, when she recovered, she found herself in the dark, and the figure was gone. "Sacré cochon bleu!" exclaimed Fatout, giving very deliberate emphasis to every portion of his terrible oath. "I would not meet the revenant, the ghost, no, not for all the bowl de punch in the world."
"Fatout," said the Honourable Mr. Listless, "did I ever see a ghost?"
"Jamais, monsieur, never."
"Then I hope I never shall, for, in the present shattered state of my nerves, I am afraid it would be too much for me. There, loosen the lace of my stays a little, for really this plebeian practice of eating, not too loose, consider my shape. That will do. And I desire that you bring me no more stories of ghosts, for though I do not believe in such things, yet, when one is awake in the night, one is apt, if one thinks of them, to have fancies that give one a kind of a chill, particularly if one opens one's eyes suddenly on one's dressing-gown, hanging in the moonlight between the bed and the window." The Honourable Mr. Listless, though he had prohibited Fatout from bringing him any more stories of ghosts, could not help thinking of that which Fatout had already brought, and, as it was uppermost in his mind, when he descended to the tea and coffee cups and the rest of the company in the library, he almost involuntarily asked Mr. Flosky, whom he looked up to as the most oraculous personage, whether any story of any ghost that had ever appeared to any one was entitled to any degree of belief. Mr. Flosky: "By far the greater number, to a very great degree." The Honourable Mr. Listless: "Really, that is very alarming."
Mr. Flosky:
"Sunt gemino somni porto. There are two gates through which ghosts find their way to the upper air, fraud and self-delusion. In the latter case, a ghost is a deceptio visus, an ocular spectrum, an idea with the force of a sensation. I have seen many ghosts myself. I dare say there are few in this company who have not seen a ghost."
The Honourable Mr. Listless:
"I am happy to say I never have, for one."
The Reverend Mr. Larynx:
"We have such high authority for ghosts that it is rank scepticism to disbelieve them. Job saw a ghost, which came for the express purpose of asking a question, and did not wait for an answer."
The Honourable Mr. Listless:
"Because Job was too frightened to give one."
The Reverend Mr. Larynx:
"Spectres appeared to the Egyptians during the darkness with which Moses covered Egypt. The witch of Endor raised the ghost of Samuel. Moses and Elias appeared on Mount Tabor. An evil spirit was sent to the army of Sennacherib, and exterminated it in a single night."
Mr. Toobad:
"Saying, the devil is come among you, having great wrath."
Mr. Flosky:
Saint Macarius interrogated a skull which was found in the desert, and made it relate, in presence of several witnesses, what was going forward in hell. St. Martin of Tours, being jealous of a pretended martyr, who was the rival saint of his neighbourhood, called up his ghost, and made him confess that he was damned. Saint Germain, being on his travels, turned out of an inn a large party of ghosts, who had every night taken possession of the table d'hôte, and consumed a copious supper.
Mr. Hilary.
Jolly ghosts, and no doubt all friars. A similar party took possession of the cellar of Monsieur Swiebach, the painter, in Paris, drank his wine, and threw the empty bottles at his head.
The Reverend Mr. Larynx.
An atrocious act.
Mr. Flosky.
Pausanias relates that the neighing of horses and the tumult of combatants were heard every night on the field of Marathon, that those who went purposely to hear these sounds suffered severely for their curiosity, but those who heard them by accident passed with impunity.
The Reverend Mr. Larynx.
I once saw a ghost myself, in my study, which is the last place where anyone but a ghost would look for me. I had not been into it for 3 months, and was going to consult Tillotson, when, on opening the door, I saw a venerable figure in a flannel dressing-gown, sitting in my armchair, and reading my Jeremy Taylor. It vanished in a moment, and so did I, and what it was or what it wanted I have never been able to ascertain.
Mr. Flosky.
It was an idea with the force of a sensation. It is seldom that ghosts appeal to 2 senses at once, but when I was in Devonshire, the following story was well attested to me. A young woman, whose lover was at sea, returning one evening over some solitary fields, saw her lover sitting on a stile over which she was to pass. Her first emotions were surprise and joy, but there was a paleness and seriousness in his face that made them give place to alarm. She advanced towards him, and he said to her, in a solemn voice, "The eye that hath seen me shall see me no more. Thine eye is upon me, but I am not." And with these words he vanished, and on that very day and hour, as it afterwards appeared, he had perished by shipwreck.
The whole party now drew round in a circle, and each related some ghostly anecdote, heedless of the flight of time, till, in a pause of the conversation, they heard the hollow tongue of midnight sounding 12. Mr. Hilary.
All these anecdotes admit of solution on psychological principles. It is more easy for a soldier, a philosopher, or even a saint, to be frightened at his own shadow, than for a dead man to come out of his grave. Medical writers cite 1,000 singular examples of the force of imagination. Persons of feeble, nervous, melancholy temperament, exhausted by fever, by labour, or by spare diet, will readily conjure up, in the magic ring of their own fantasy, spectres, gorgons, chimeras, and all the objects of their hatred and their love. We are most of us like Don Quixote, to whom a windmill was a giant, and Dulcinea a magnificent princess, all more or less the dupes of our own imagination, though we do not all go so far as to see ghosts, or to fancy ourselves pipkins and teapots.
Mr. Flosky.
I can safely say I have seen too many ghosts myself to believe in their external existence. I have seen all kinds of ghosts, black spirits and white, red spirits and grey, some in the shapes of venerable old men, who have met me in my rambles at noon, some of beautiful young women who have peeped through my curtains at midnight.
The Honourable Mr. Listless.
And have proved, I doubt not, palpable to feeling as to sight.
Mr. Flosky.
By no means, sir. You reflect upon my purity. Myself and my friends, particularly my friend Mr. Sackbut, are famous for our purity. No, sir, genuine untangible ghosts. I live in a world of ghosts. I see a ghost at this moment.
Mr. Flosky fixed his eye on a door at the farther end of the library. The company looked in the same direction. The door silently opened, and a ghastly figure, shrouded in white drapery, with the semblance of a bloody turban on its head, entered and stalked slowly up the apartment. Mr Flosky, familiar as he was with ghosts, was not prepared for this apparition, and made the best of his way out at the opposite door. Mrs Hilary and Marionetta followed, screaming. The Honourable Mr Listless, by 2 turns of his body, rolled first off the sofa and then under it. The Reverend Mr Larynx leaped up and fled with so much precipitation that he overturned the table on the foot of Mr Glowry. Mr Glowry roared with pain in the ear of Mr Toobad. Mr Toobad's alarm so bewildered his senses that, missing the door, he threw up one of the windows, jumped out in his panic, and plunged over head and ears in the moat. Mr Asterius and his son, who were on the watch for their mermaid, were attracted by the splashing, threw a net over him, and dragged him to land. Scythrop and Mr Hilary meanwhile had hastened to his assistance, and on arriving at the edge of the moat, followed by several servants with ropes and torches, found Mr Asterius and Aquarius busy in endeavouring to extricate Mr Toobad from the net, who was entangled in the meshes, and floundering with rage. Scythrop was lost in amazement, but Mr Hilary saw, at one view, all the circumstances of the adventure, and burst into an immoderate fit of laughter, on recovering from which, he said to Mr Asterius, "You have caught an odd fish indeed." Mr Toobad was highly exasperated at this unseasonable pleasantry, but Mr Hilary softened his anger by producing a knife and cutting the Gordian knot of his reticular envelopment. "You see," said Mr Toobad, "you see, gentlemen, in my unfortunate person, proof upon proof of the present dominion of the devil in the affairs of this world, and I have no doubt but that the apparition of this night was Apollyon himself in disguise, sent for the express purpose of terrifying me into this complication of misadventures. The devil is come among you, having great wrath, because he knoweth that he hath but a short time." End of chapter.